Hey everybody, my name is Ashley and I am here with font expert Joyce Ketterer and also my colleague Patrick. And we're going to talk about font licensing today. We found that this is a common concern with a lot of our agency partners, so we want to address some of those common questions. So Joyce, would you mind just go ahead and introduce yourself to everybody?
Thanks, Ashley. So my name is Joyce Ketterer. I'm the CEO and owner of Darden Studio, which is a font foundry. Our most well-known fonts are Omnis and Halyard. Darden Studio was founded in 2005 by Joshua Darden, who has since parted the company. I purchased it from him in 2019 after we worked together for about 10 years. I'm not a designer. I am an expert in font licensing and other business topics.
Awesome. Let's go ahead and dive in.
All right. Thanks again, Joyce, for hanging out with us for a while. So why do we call them foundries?
For entirely sentimental reasons. When fonts were first made, they were pieces of metal, as everybody knows, metal in a tray. So they were founded, made in foundries. And though we now make software, we still call ourselves foundries.
Got it. So when people say is font software, break that down for us and explain how that works.
The font is the delivery mechanism for actually what's called a typeface, which is the collection of letters or glyphs. And a font could be any delivery mechanism. The wood box is a delivery mechanism. Who knows what it will be someday? Now it's software.
And so font licensing.
Mm-hmm.
What is a font license, Joyce? How would you explain that?
So it's the contract that governs the use of the font by the end user licensee. It's like any software. I think this is not my field of expertise. I'm not a historian, but I think there were always licenses, even when it was pieces of metal. But it's exactly the same as the kind of end user license agreement that you would receive for other kinds of software, or the kind of license you might get if you were licensing a photograph or music for your company. And in fact, in many cases, the font license is a hybrid of those two models, the software model and the intellectual property model.
Got it.
I'm always confused by this. What's the difference between a font license and a EULA, or the end user license agreement?
In real legal terms, there is no difference. Colloquially, we tend to say EULA when we mean what is often called the desktop license or the basic license, the first starting level of licensing. And we tend to use the word license, not the abbreviated term, because EULA, of course, just stands for end user license agreement when we're talking about other kinds of licensing. So a web embedding license, we call a license. And we tend to say EULA just sort of casually when we're talking about that basic level of licensing. But from a legal perspective, it's all
the same.
A license. It's all a contract that governs the use.
Got it.
Got it. And so, Joyce, what are usage rights and how do they affect how a font can be used?
All right. So I should say first, I'm not a lawyer, and none of this constitutes legal advice. But second, another caveat, there is no universal answer to this question. Years ago, I was asked by Extensis to give an hour-long lecture about fonts to a room full of end-user side people at large companies like Disney. And I knew they really wanted me to give them a list, and there is none. I spent literally weeks trying to think of any universal thing I could say. And The only thing I could say is that all font licenses will allow you to install the font somewhere to use it in some way. Like,
Mm-hmm.
the when we talk about usage rights, the we're generally talking about not the way you use the software, but the way that you use the typeface. So at Dart and Studio, we try to be very clear that we are licensing software, and to keep that as clean, as crisp as possible, that distinction. But so for instance, our basic level of licensing permits installation on computers for use by people to create images and documents. And we basically don't restrict how those images and documents get used until you start to need to embed the font. So that's a different kind of use of the software. And then other kinds of licensing is needed depending on how the software is getting deployed. That's not universally true. Lots of foundries think more along the lines of their licensing IP, so that they would draw a distinction if some draw a distinction between commercial and personal use. Others, packaging would require additional licensing. Broadcast, in the same way that, going back to if you were licensing music, you would think, is it in a movie? Is it in a commercial? Is it on social media? So that is something that is sometimes a part of a license. And those are the sorts of things that you need to think about with regards to usage. Almost no licenses permit you to alter the software, or to change the font, the typeface, the glyphs. Though some do, because
Got it.
there's no universal answer.
Got it. Thank you.
So what are some common usage mistakes?
Well, I think the most common is thinking that when you have bought a license at no matter what level, that if that you can then use it in any way that you are physically capable of using it. And that's just not true, because the way that computer operating systems interact with fonts is that they don't put up any restrictions. So not only will it not stop you from doing something very obviously not allowed, like converting the software to a new file format so you can embed it, it's not going to stop you from duplicating. So I could, I might have a one CPU license, no distribution. I can still send it to literally, physically, it can send it to my contractor, and then they can install it on 1,000 computers and do a whole bunch of things. So people tend to rely on the software to tell them when they're not allowed to do a thing, and that can result in all sorts of, scope increase of the use over what is permitted under the license.
Got it.
Are there common types of additional licensing people might want?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, it depends a little bit about what the primary license, the starting point is. For a lot of foundries, things like packaging, logos, broadcast, social media are not covered at the basic level, in which case that would be an additional, very common use. At Dart and Studio, and there are plenty of foundries who do this, that is all covered at the basic level. So for us, that is not but it's a common need. For foundries with our model of licensing, the kind of add-ons that you would need would be embedding. So web and application embedding are the most common. There's also something that a lot of foundries call server licensing, which is basically web apps and web to print. We at Dart and Studio do not license it using that terminology. We treat it as a web license that is priced as a web app, but nonetheless, it's a very useful kind of additional licensing.
Got it.
More obscurely, you might also need, I guess, ebooks. That's another one that we cover at the basic level, but not everyone does. And distribution to permit distributing the fonts to contractors who are not at the primary company.
Joyce, what are some legal disputes over font licensing? How does that affect a business when they get involved and they're not doing what they're supposed to do?
The most common one I see, in large part because the way our license is written, is web embedding. That was not permitted. And that generally happens because the licensee purchases a license and then they give it to their web developer and they say, we have a license for this. And the web developer hears all possible uses are covered, but it's still true that the people at the licensee may not even understand how the web developer needs to use the fonts and that web embedding is even necessary. So it's like each doesn't understand the other's job. And then the web developer just goes and converts the fonts to the correct file format for web embedding and embeds the fonts. That happens all the time. For foundries with more IP focused licensing models, you can get all sorts of things, like a logo, for instance, that is not permitted. You can also sometimes get disputes over modifications to the software, where more than just converting the file format, someone went in and actually changed the letter forms. That's happened to us several times. We have our top seller, Omnis, has a slightly odd one that comes as the default character. There are alts, and we have had on several occasions contractors on behalf of their client. And again, the client didn't even know they did it. Has created a hybridized one from the default and the alts, and then they swap it, and that's not allowed. And we have to stop that because more than just wanting to guard our work, we're concerned about caching issues and interfering with other people's use of the retail build of the font. So these sorts of things happen quite often on the grand scale of things, though I think for any individual licensee, it's not that likely as long as you make sure to keep communication channels open with the team and check in to make sure that the uses are permitted under the license.
Other software enforces its own license, but fonts don't do that. Why is that?
Because when operating system software was first designed, nobody really thought about fonts, and operating system software basically treats fonts like they're plugins. I have spoken with people at Microsoft and also Apple who are on their fonts teams, and there's just no way to change this without completely rethinking operating system software, which is not going to happen. So fonts are installed fundamentally, even if it doesn't seem like this to the end user, they're just installed by dropping them into a folder. And they then get duplicated over and over in the course of the use in the background by the operating system. So you really is no way to put in the kind of digital rights management that other kinds of software has. And then you add to that that a lot of the limitations inherent to font software licensing is not the sort of thing that has a different workflow. So we keep mentioning logos and broadcast, those sorts of things. That's an identical workflow. So and that's why Darden Studio doesn't have those kinds of restrictions. But there's nothing inherently wrong with having those kinds of restrictions. It's thinking of fonts as creative output and intellectual property more than you think of it as software. And the problem in my thinking with doing that is not that there's anything wrong with it, but that end users tend to think of it as software. So it just doesn't occur to some significant percentage of end users to think of it in the other way. It's sort of like the proverbial visual test. You know, do you see two faces or do you see a vase? Like, most people, when they look at fonts, they see software. Some percentage of people see IP. And then that's how we get into this confusion.
And you mentioned operating system. So why is the real enemy the operating system?
That's a silly thing I say. And I say that mostly when I'm talking to other font people. I say the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and the enemy is the operating system software. So therefore, our end users who may, you know, from our perspective, get up to a bunch of shenanigans are not the enemy, because they are the enemy of our enemy.
Got it.
That's awesome. All right. So do you have any tips for creative professionals to manage licenses in a easy but effective way, or the best way?
So it does depend a lot on the kind of company you have. So font servers are very helpful for controlling a lot of things. And Extensis offers one. There are other platforms. And that just allows you to keep track of how many users you have and who they are. I'd also to put in some notes about, you know, this one permits broadcast, this one doesn't. In this scenario where you really just have one set of corporate fonts, I would say that the absolute best strategy is to have a point person who is responsible for making sure that all uses get vetted by them. And, you know, we have a couple customers that do this, and, you know, they basically write me every couple months. And, you know, 90% of the time they say, we're doing this. And I say, yes, that's already covered. And then they go on their merry way. But one of the ways that you get into trouble is when you have a lot of departments doing different things and no central repository of knowledge.
So we want to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Joyce, for providing knowledge about type design and licensing and fonts. And we'd love to know if there are some additional topics that we can share. We'd love to bring more experts and professionals just to help you guys along the way, because we are definitely here to support. So thank you again, and you guys enjoy the rest of your day.